I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about the diversity of fungi in the way that we did the diversity of animals, but I do want to mention major phyla that we find in the kingdom fungus. This includes the chytrids, Zygomycetes, Glomeromycetes, Ascomycetes, and Basidiomycetes. Chytrids are found in a lot of different places, including on land, terrestrial, and also aquatic and marine, including hydrothermal vents, which are pretty extreme environments. And their ecological roles are also diverse. They could be decomposers or parasites or mutualists, but they're important because it seems that they diverged first. So like fungi, like porphyrin, sponges are the basal animal group that branched off first. Chytrids are the basal fungal group. And we think this because of molecular evidence, but also because they have flagellated spores called zoospores, which look a little bit like the ancestral protist. And here you can see this flagellated spore that you would find in chytrids. And this is a look at your general phylogeny of fungus, with the common ancestor of all fungi back here, and chytrids being the first to branch off. Zygomycetes can be parasites or commensal symbionts, which means they live in close proximity to another organism that they benefit from, but they don't necessarily harm, like a parasite would. And they include fast-growing molds. They have cenocytic hyphae, which, if you recall, means those hyphae that don't have septa separating the cells. Right? So it's almost like one big cytoplasmic goo with a bunch of nuclei. And they tend to have asexual sporangia for producing haploid spores, but they also have an interesting sexual life cycle, and we'll look at the life cycle of bread mold as an example. Zygomycetes is in fact named after zygosporangia, which are their sexually produced structures that are the site of karyogamy, meaning two different organisms come together and they combine nuclei, but those nuclei haven't fused yet. So you have two different nuclei from two different individuals next to one another. Here you can see the asexual path, which includes these haploid spores undergoing mitosis to produce multicellular structures like these sporangia, which then can go and release spores that will go grow into new individuals. But they can reproduce sexually, and they have two different mating types generally, which will come together. So here we have two different individuals of compatible mating types, plus and minus, and they come together, and at this point they fuse and move the nucleus from each individual into the same structure. So the nuclei aren't fused yet, but the structure now has the nuclei from both parent organisms, and this is what that looks like. This is that zygosporangium. So this is plasmogamy, which we talked about in the last video, where you move these nuclei into the same cell. But then, as we talked about before, in this zygosporangium, karyogamy will take place, where the nuclei actually fuse. You have a diploid nucleus, and then that diploid nucleus will quickly undergo meiosis, and you will produce haploid spores, which will then go and grow through mitosis into either an asexually reproducing sporangia or a sexually reproducing zygosporangium. The zygosporangia are pretty neat. They are hardy, and they can often resist freezing conditions and dry conditions, and so they can survive for a long time until more favorable conditions come around. And some of them have the ability to aim their sporangia and shoot them toward bright light. So they shoot the spores in the direction of the light. And this is what that looks like. It almost looks like a field of sunflowers, but fungus. Glomeromycetes used to be thought to be part of Zygomycetes, but some molecular analyses have shown that they are their own separate clade. And almost all of them form arbuscular mycorrhizae. And mycorrhizae, again, form around the roots of plants, and they form a mutualistic symbiotic relationship. And arbuscular means they have these hyphae that stick into the cells of the plant root. They bust through the cell wall, and there they can directly exchange nutrients with the plant. And here you can actually see an arbuscular mycorrhizal fungus. These are hyphae sticking into the cell wall, into the cell of a plant root. Ascomycetes live all over the place, marine, freshwater, terrestrial habitats, and they're pretty diverse, but they are also named for a particular sexual structure that they have. They make a special kind of spore in an asci, and that comes in a fruiting body called an ascocarp. And sometimes they're called sac fungi because of this. Maybe the most famous example is the true morel mushroom, or morchella, that looks like this. And this is the ascocarp up here that holds the special ascospores. And those morels are decomposers, but there are also Ascomycetes, which are plant pathogens or symbionts. A lot of them form associations with green algae that form lichens. So lichens are always a green algae and a fungus like Ascomycetes. And here you can see in our Ascomycetes life cycle, you do have an asexual path that results in a haploid hyphae producing conidiophores, which grow and then produce their own haploid spores that leave, and these are called conidia. But these can then mate sexually if they have the opportunity, and they come together. Again, they fuse through plasmogamy with two different individual cells so that you have the two different nuclei that are genetically distinct in the same cell. And then they form a structure. In this case, it's a different structure than we've looked at before. This is the ascus, which is going to grow and end up giving us the unique structure that gives them their name. And then they fuse through karyogamy, the two nuclei do, so that we have a diploid nucleus. That diploid nucleus will then undergo meiosis and produce haploid spores, and we're going to grow a bunch of those haploid spores in this structure. This big structure is called an ascocarp. And again, that's like the head of the morel mushroom. And in here are asci, which are full of the little ascospores. Basidiomycetes are probably the fungus that you're most used to seeing. They include the mushrooms that you find in the store, puffballs that we'll look at a picture of in a moment, shelf fungi that you see coming off of old dead trunks in the forest. They're defined by this club-like structure called a basidium, and they have a diploid stage in the life cycle that we'll look at here in a moment. But very many of them are decomposers of wood, so you'll find them in the forest. Here you can see the shelf fungi sticking off of a fallen log in the forest. These are very, very common. Here you see an example of a puffball, so they can pop open and up come all the spores. This is also something that you might see in the forest around here. And these are maidenveil fungi, which still have this structure that we were talking about, the basidiocarp. And you may not have seen these, but they're pretty cool, so I thought I'd include a picture of them. They also break down old wood and leaf litter. A unique thing about Basidiomycetes is that they have this long-lived dikaryotic mycelium, which means they have two nuclei, not yet fused, but two nuclei in the same cells, and generally that is short-lived in other phyla, but here it can produce these giant fruiting bodies called basidiocarps, which are what you see in the supermarket. So, when you go to Kroger and you buy those white mushrooms that you're going to cut up and put on your salad, those white mushrooms are examples of basidiocarps. And here you see, we form these spores, basidiospores, which disperse and grow into these haploid hyphae. And there are two different mating types in Basidiomycetes that will come together through plasmogamy, again, that process where two different cells come together and fuse, but the nuclei don't yet fuse. So now we've got two different nuclei from two different individuals. They're genetically different in the same structure, and these can grow into these giant multicellular basidiocarps, where the rest of sexual reproduction can occur, the fusion of the nuclei. So again, these are the mushrooms that you will see in the store, toadstools, whatever you call them. And it's in these guys that karyogamy will occur, where the actual fusion of the nucleus will occur, and you have a diploid nucleus. The diploid nucleus part is short-lived, just like in the rest of fungi, and this will undergo meiosis quickly and form new spores, which will then be released. This is all happening in these little gills on the bottom of the mushroom cap. And then they'll release these spores, which will go out and plant themselves and undergo mitosis and form these multicellular hyphae and mycelium beds again. These mushrooms can pop up very quickly within a few hours. It's kind of amazing. And so you can go to bed one night and after a rainy day, and you can come back up the next morning, and these multicellular structures have popped up in these fairy rings that kind of appear very often around where maybe there used to be a tree stump or something. There's a lot of organic material in the bottom. And you see something like this, where you have this circle of the fruiting bodies of the basidiocarps. And again, this is something that you'll find around here a lot if you go meandering after a wet period. The main groups that I want you to distinguish amongst fungi are ecological groups. And so I want you to recognize them as decomposers, mutualists, and pathogens. I want you to understand the difference between these groups. Lots of fungi are decomposers, and this is essential ecologically for us. They're very good decomposers of cellulose, of lignin, meaning wood, and they break things down that we can't, and they recycle those nutrients back into the soil of the living world. And if we didn't have decomposers like fungus, we would not be able to have life as we know it. So decomposition is an essential function of many fungus, an essential ecological function that we couldn't live without. But the mutualistic relationships that fungi have with plants are also very important. Mutualistic meaning two organisms live in a close symbiotic association and both benefit. And mutualistic fungi will often take nutrients from the host organism. That's how the fungi benefit. But they will reciprocate with various actions that could be allowing for the breakup of new minerals that the plant can take up, or trading often nutrients between plants, and the mycorrhizae of fungus are the medium for that. Many fungi are considered endophytes, and they live inside different parts of plants, and they make the plants more resistant to extremes like heat or drought or heavy metals or salinity. Most of these endophytes are Ascomycetes. Many fungus also have associations with animals. Cows have fungi often in their stomachs that help, along with bacteria, break down plant material for those grazing mammals. And ants use plant material to raise fungi to eat in their farms. If you've ever seen leafcutter ants at the zoo or anywhere else, they bring little cuttings of leaves back to their nests, but they don't eat the leaves. They bring the leaves as food for fungus, which they provide the fungus, and then they eat products of the fungus as the fungus grow. We already mentioned lichens, where fungi have associations with algae, and those algae are able to photosynthesize and make sugars with energy from the light, and the fungus are able to break down either the tree or sometimes minerals from the rock, and then provide those minerals or those nutrients to the algae. But as beneficial as they can be, a lot of fungi are also parasites or pathogens. Mostly plants. They can provide blights on much of our fruit harvest. We lose a lot of our fruit to fungi. A lot of our crops can be destroyed due to fungal infections. Here you can see fungal infections on corn and maple trees and rye. You see them on wheat. You find them on the strawberries in the back of your refrigerator. One fungus that can harm wheat and rye, called ergot, also is the raw material for LSD, and there are stories of villages in the Middle Ages who had infections in their rye supply just go insane. Entire villages going insane, and it's thought it was because of a fungal infection in their grain supply. Ringworm, athlete's foot, yeast infections are all examples of fungal infections of humans. But on the flip side, we get a lot of our antibiotics, like penicillin, the original antibiotic, from fungus, and, beer, bread, cheese. Thanks.